Nobody talks about what happened in Thorn Hollow anymore. The town doesn't exist on modern maps, and if you ask the old-timers in the surrounding valleys about it, they'll change the subject real quick. But I found the letters. I found the journals. And what I discovered about that spring of 1912 will make you question everything you think you know about those mountains. Let me be straight with you. I'm a folklore researcher, not some paranormal investigator trying to sell you ghost stories. I deal in facts, in documented accounts, in the mundane explanations behind rural legends. But Thorn Hollow breaks all my rules. It started with rain that smelled like blood. The first account comes from a letter dated April 3rd, 1912, written by Margaret Ashby to her sister in Roanoke. Margaret was a schoolteacher, educated, rational, not the type to fall for superstition. Her handwriting in the original letter is steady, methodical. This matters because of what she describes. "The rain began yesterday evening," she wrote. "At first we thought nothing of it. Spring storms are common here. But when I stepped onto the porch this morning, the smell hit me like a physical force. Sarah, I know how this sounds, but it smelled exactly like blood. Not like iron or rust, like actual blood. The kind of smell you get in a butcher's shop, but stronger. Sweet and metallic and wrong." Now here's where it gets interesting. Margaret wasn't alone in this observation. I've found 17 separate accounts from Thorn Hollow residents, all describing the same phenomenon within a 3-day period. 17 people don't all hallucinate the same specific smell. That's not how mass hysteria works. The town physician, Dr. Emil Garrett, collected samples of the rainwater. His notes, which I found in a medical archive in Charleston, described the water as normal in appearance, clear, without discoloration. He sent samples to a laboratory in Pittsburgh. The results came back showing nothing unusual, just ordinary rainwater with the typical mineral content you'd expect from Appalachian runoff. But the smell persisted, and it got worse. By April 5th, people started getting sick. Not everyone, that's crucial, only certain people. Margaret Ashby described it in another letter. "The Hendersons are bedridden with fever, so are the Pritchards and old Samuel Vance, but others like myself feel nothing." Dr. Garrett cannot explain the pattern. He says their symptoms resemble influenza, but influenza doesn't discriminate like this. Here's what I need you to understand about Appalachian communities in 1912. These were isolated, tight-knit populations. Thorn Hollow had maybe 200 residents. Everyone knew everyone. They shared the same water sources, ate similar foods, lived in comparable conditions. So when a sickness strikes selectively, people notice. They look for patterns. And they found one. Every single person who fell ill had attended the Easter service at Thorn Hollow Methodist Church on March 31st. Every single one. Now, before you jump to conclusions about poisoned communion wine or contaminated wafers, Dr. Garrett already thought of that. He examined the remaining sacramental supplies. Nothing. He interviewed everyone who'd attended the service. They'd all eaten and drunk the same things. The only people who got sick were those who had participated in a specific part of the service, the anointing ritual. Reverend Josiah Blackwood had introduced this ritual that Easter. It wasn't standard Methodist practice, but Blackwood had his own ideas about worship. According to witness accounts, he'd anointed each congregant's forehead with oil, making the sign of the cross while speaking a blessing in what some described as the old language. Here's where Margaret Ashby's letters become invaluable. She was suspicious of Blackwood from the start. "He arrived in Thorn Hollow last October," she wrote, claiming to be sent by the regional conference. "But something about him feels off, Sarah. He knows things he shouldn't know. He mentioned my mother's maiden name in conversation once, a name I've never spoken aloud here. When I asked how he knew it, he just smiled and said, 'God reveals all things to those who listen.' I did my homework on Josiah Blackwood. This is where the story gets darker. There's no record of any Josiah Blackwood in Methodist Conference records from that period. None. I checked every archive, every registry. The man simply appeared in Thorn Hollow with forged credentials that nobody bothered to verify, because frankly, who would lie about being a Methodist minister in rural Appalachia? What would be the point? But Blackwood had a past. It took me 3 years of digging, but I found it. In 1907, a man matching Blackwood's description was run out of a town called Millbrook, Kentucky. The town records list him as Jonas Blackwood, confidence man and practitioner of dark arts. He'd been caught robbing graves for what he claimed were ritual components. The sheriff's report includes a bizarre detail. Jonas Blackwood told his captors that he was searching for the blood of the innocent, and that he would find it in a place where the old powers still sleep. Millbrook is only about 150 miles from where Thorn Hollow used to be. Now, I'm not saying I believe in dark arts or old powers. What I'm saying is that Josiah Blackwood believed in them, and that belief drove his actions. This is important for understanding what happened next. By April 7th, 12 people had died. 12 out of 43 who'd attended that Easter service and received the anointing. Dr. Garrett's notes become increasingly frantic. "The fever burns them from the inside," he wrote. "Their final hours are marked by delirium. They speak of seeing things, figures in the rain, shapes moving through the mountains." Mrs. Henderson's last words were, "He's opening the door." She died staring at the ceiling, terror in her eyes. The rain continued. That smell, that blood smell, grew stronger. Margaret Ashby organized a town meeting on April 8th. By this point, people were scared. They wanted answers. They wanted Blackwood to explain himself. But when they went to the parsonage, they found it empty. Blackwood had vanished, and he'd taken something with him. The church's records book was gone. More significantly, a lockbox that had been kept in the church basement was missing. Several of the older residents remembered that box. It had been there for generations, sealed with a lock nobody had the key to. Local legend said it contained artifacts from the original settlers, Scots-Irish families who'd fled religious persecution and brought their own traditions, some pre-Christian, into these mountains. Margaret's letter from April 9th is hard to read. Her handwriting has deteriorated, the letters shaky and rushed. "We found Blackwood's notes in the parsonage chimney," she wrote. "He'd tried to burn them, but failed to destroy everything. Sarah, what I read terrifies me. He wrote about something called the Bloodfall Invocation. He claimed that the original settlers of this valley had made a pact with something old, something that predated their Christianity. He believed that by reenacting their ritual, he could gain power over life and death itself. I want to pause here and talk about context, because this matters. The early Appalachian settlers did bring syncretic religious practices with them. This is documented history. Scottish and Irish folk traditions, mixed with Protestant Christianity, mixed with Cherokee beliefs they encountered here, it created a unique spiritual landscape. But academic knowledge of these practices is one thing. Blackwood's notes suggest he had access to something more specific, more dangerous. The notes Margaret found included drawings. She sketched them in her letter, geometric patterns, symbols that don't match any recognized religious tradition I've studied. And written in the margins, over and over, "The rain is the calling, the smell is the answer." The door opens when enough innocent blood has touched the threshold. On April 10th, something broke. The rain intensified into a deluge. Multiple accounts describe it the same way. The water came down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. And that smell, the blood smell, became overpowering. People locked themselves in their homes. Those who were sick began to scream. Thomas Pritchard, a coal miner and one of the few literate working-class men in town, kept a diary. His entry from that day: "The sick are having visions, all of them the same vision. They say they see the original settlers standing in a circle around something that looks like a well. They say the settlers are cutting their own throats and bleeding into the well while chanting. They say there's something in the well looking up at them, something with too many eyes. Shared hallucinations are possible in cases of certain toxins or diseases. But this level of specificity, this consistency across multiple people who weren't in contact with each other, that pushes the boundaries of medical explanation." Dr. Garrett made a decision. He gathered a group of healthy men, including Thomas Pritchard and Margaret's brother Robert, and they went looking for Blackwood. They had a theory about where he'd gone. 2 miles outside Thorn Hollow, up in the hollows where the oldest trees grew, there was a place locals called Weeping Rock. It was a natural spring that emerged from a cave system. Cherokee oral history, passed down through the few remaining families in the area, said that Weeping Rock was a sacred site, but also a dangerous one, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. The search party found Blackwood there. This is where I need to be careful about how I present this information, because the accounts become difficult to corroborate. What we have are 3 surviving testimonies, from Thomas Pritchard, from Robert Ashby, and from a man named Samuel Crow. All 3 men tell the same basic story, but the details are so strange that most historians have dismissed them as trauma-induced fabrications. I'm not so sure. They found Blackwood in the cave behind Weeping Rock. He'd set up what Pritchard described as an altar of bones and stones. The lockbox from the church was open beside him, its contents spread out. Old papers, a cup made of dark wood, and something Pritchard couldn't quite describe. It looked like a book, he wrote, but the pages seemed to move on their own, like they were breathing. Blackwood was performing some kind of ritual. He'd drawn symbols on the cave walls in what appeared to be blood, and he was chanting in a language none of them recognized. But here's the detail that all 3 men agreed on. There was a pool of water in the center of the cave, and the rain was somehow falling up into it from below. Yes, you read that right. Falling upward. It defied all natural law, Robert Ashby wrote in a statement later. The water rose from the pool in drops, ascending toward the cave ceiling. And it was red, not rust-colored, not brown, red like fresh blood. The smell was unbearable. When the men tried to stop Blackwood, he turned to them and spoke. All 3 accounts include his words, verbatim. Too late. The door is open. The old ones accept my offering. Thorn Hollow's blood has bought my passage. Then he stepped backward into the pool and vanished. Not dove in, not fell in, vanished. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, and the pool was just ordinary water, flowing normally with no trace of him. The men searched for hours. They brought ropes, they brought lights. The pool was only about 4 feet deep. There was nowhere for a man to hide, but Blackwood was gone. When they returned to Thorn Hollow, the rain had stopped. That smell, that cursed blood smell, was fading, and the sick were recovering, just like that, as if someone had flipped a switch. By April 12th, everyone who had survived the initial illness was back on their feet, weak but alive. 31 people had died in total. Now here's what's important. The official explanation. The county coroner attributed the deaths to an outbreak of hemorrhagic fever of unknown origin. The disappearance of Reverend Josiah Blackwood was recorded as suspected desertion and possible drowning. The strange rain was never officially acknowledged. When pressed about the smell, authorities suggested atmospheric conditions combined with decay from winter animal deaths in the mountains. It's a neat explanation. It's rational. It explains away everything without requiring belief in anything supernatural. But it doesn't explain the letters I found from 3 different geological surveyors who visited the area in late April 1912. All 3, independently, reported that the water table around Thorn Hollow had changed. Springs that had flowed for generations had dried up. New ones had appeared in unexpected places, and the cave at Weeping Rock had collapsed. Completely sealed, as if it had never existed. It doesn't explain why Thorn Hollow was abandoned over the next 2 years. By 1914, every single resident had moved away. The town was empty. And here's the thing about Appalachian communities. They don't just abandon their homes. These were people with generational ties to the land. Their families had been there for 100 years or more, but they all left. Margaret Ashby's final letter to her sister, dated June 1912, offers a clue. We cannot stay here, Sarah. The place is wrong now. The water tastes different. The animals won't come near the old town center, and every night we hear sounds from the mountains. Like chanting, like that language Blackwood used. Some of us have started having the dreams. We see the well. We see the things with too many eyes. We're leaving before we become like the others. What others? She never explained. I visited the site of Thorn Hollow 5 years ago. It's just forest now, reclaimed by nature. But I found the foundation stones of the church. I found what I believe was the location of Weeping Rock, though the spring is dry and the cave entrance is indeed sealed. And I found something else, Carved into a tree that had to be at least 100 years old, I found symbols that matched the ones Margaret had sketched in her letter. Underneath them, someone had carved words in English. He opened the door. "We cannot close it. Forgive us." Now let me address what you're probably thinking. This is all folklore, legend, the kind of story that grows in the telling. And you might be right. But consider this. The meteorological records from April 1912 show no significant rainfall in the Appalachian region during that period. None. The official weather data contradicts every single account from Thorn Hollow residents. Either dozens of people collectively fabricated a story about rain that lasted 10 days, or the rain was so localized, so specific to that one valley, that it didn't register on any surrounding weather stations. The medical records from the outbreak don't match any known disease pattern. The hemorrhagic fever diagnosis was essentially a guess, something to put in the official documents because doctors couldn't say, "We have no idea what killed these people." And Josiah Blackwood, or Jonas Blackwood, or whatever his real name was never found. No body, no arrest record, no sightings. He vanished as completely as Thorn Hollow itself eventually would. But here's what troubles me most, and why I spent years researching this story. It wasn't unique. Once I started looking, I found similar accounts from other isolated Appalachian communities. Different time periods, different details, but the same basic pattern. A stranger arrives, introduces a new ritual. Strange phenomena occur, people die, the community dissolves. There's a case from North Carolina in 1889, another from West Virginia in 1923, one from Tennessee in 1901. The details vary, but certain elements repeat. Unusual weather, an unexplained smell, shared visions among the afflicted, and always a reference to opening a door or calling something old. This is where I want to talk about what this might actually mean, because I don't believe in demons or ancient evil gods. I'm a researcher, remember? I deal in facts. But I do believe in cultural trauma. I believe in the power of ritual to affect human psychology. And I believe that the Appalachian region has a complex spiritual history that we've never fully understood or documented. The early settlers brought traditions from the Old World, practices that mixed Christianity with much older beliefs. When they encountered the indigenous peoples here, there was cultural exchange, voluntary and otherwise. The Cherokee had their own sacred sites, their own understanding of these mountains as places of power. When you layer these belief systems on top of each other, across generations, in isolated communities where oral tradition is stronger than written record, you create something unique. You create a landscape where belief has real power. Not supernatural power, psychological power. The power to make people sick through stress and fear. The power to create shared experiences through cultural conditioning. The power to drive entire communities away from their homes because the trauma of what happened becomes too much to bear. Josiah Blackwood understood this. His notes, the fragments Margaret managed to save, reveal a man who'd studied folklore, who understood ritual psychology, who knew how to manipulate belief systems. He wasn't a wizard. He was a con artist with academic knowledge and serious psychological problems. But, and this is important, that doesn't mean what happened wasn't real for the people of Thorn Hollow. The rain might have had a mundane explanation. Algae blooms can create strange smells. Atmospheric conditions can produce localized weather phenomena. The illness might have been an actual disease that we simply can't identify from the limited medical records. But the trauma was real. The deaths were real. The dissolution of an entire community was real. And the question that haunts me is this. If Blackwood was just a mentally ill con artist, why did he disappear so completely? Why did the cave seal itself? And yes, caves can collapse naturally. But the timing is remarkable. Why did the water table change so dramatically? Why did every single surviving resident choose to abandon their homes? I've interviewed descendants of Thorn Hollow families. Most of them know nothing about what happened. The story wasn't passed down, but a few, the ones whose grandparents talked, they have fragments, little pieces of warnings. Don't trust strangers who know things they shouldn't. Don't participate in rituals you don't understand. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. The mountains remember. That last one gets to me. The mountains remember. It's such a strange thing to say, but multiple people said it, independently, without knowing they were echoing each other. What does it mean for a place to remember? Not people, but the place itself. I think what it means is this. Trauma soaks into the land, the story becomes part of the landscape. And in isolated communities, where oral tradition is strong, where people still believe in things modern society has dismissed, that trauma can persist in ways we don't fully understand. The Thorn Hollow case teaches us something important about the intersection of belief, trauma, and community. It shows us how a single person with malicious intent can weaponize faith and tradition. It demonstrates the power of psychological manipulation in isolated populations. And it reminds us that dismissing people's experiences as just superstition or mass hysteria doesn't actually help us understand what happened to them. Because here's the thing, whether or not there was actually something supernatural in that cave, the people of Thorn Hollow experienced something that destroyed their community. Their suffering was real. Their fear was real. The loss of their homes and their way of life was real, and we owe it to them to try to understand what happened, even if the explanation makes us uncomfortable. I keep coming back to those carvings I found. He opened the door. We cannot close it. Forgive us. Who carved that message? Why did they feel they needed forgiveness? What door are they talking about? In my more rational moments, I think it's metaphorical. Blackwood opened the door to doubt, to fear, to the destruction of community trust. Once that door is open, you can't just close it again. The damage is done. But then I remember the consistency of the accounts. I remember the meteorological impossibilities. I remember standing in those woods where Thorn Hollow used to be and feeling something. Not supernatural necessarily, but a weight, a heaviness in the air, a sense of wrongness. The scientific part of my brain says it's just suggestion, just me projecting my knowledge of the history onto the environment. But the human part, the part that evolved to sense danger, to read patterns, to survive in a world full of hidden threats, that part isn't so sure. Let me share one more piece of evidence, and then I'll give you my final assessment. In 2018, a group of hikers found human remains in what they thought was a natural cave system about 3 miles from the old Thorn Hollow site. The remains were identified through DNA testing as belonging to a man named Jonas Blackwood, wanted for grave robbery in Kentucky in 1907. The remains were approximately 100 years old. The strange thing, the cave where they found him wasn't on any geological surveys. It appeared to be a recent sinkhole formation, and the position of the bones suggested that Blackwood had been alive when he entered the space. There were scratch marks on the stone walls, evidence of desperate attempts to escape. But here's what really gets me. The cave floor was covered in what geologists identified as mineral deposits consistent with ancient spring water flow. In other words, the place had once been filled with water, but it had been dry for at least 50 years based on the geological evidence. So either Blackwood found this cave, it filled with water and drowned him, then the water source dried up and sealed him in for a century. Or something else happened. Something the scientific evidence can't quite account for. I don't know which explanation I believe. What I do know is this. Thorn Hollow was a real place. Real people lived there, real people died there. And whether the rain that smelled like blood was a natural phenomenon misremembered through trauma or something genuinely unexplained, it destroyed a community and left scars that persist to this day. The lesson here isn't about the supernatural. It's about the danger of blind faith, the power of manipulation, and the importance of questioning authorities, especially religious authorities who claim special knowledge or divine right. Blackwood, whatever his real name was, exploited people's faith. He used their belief system against them. He introduced foreign elements into their rituals and convinced them it was divinely inspired. And when things went wrong, he disappeared, leaving them to deal with the consequences. This pattern repeats throughout history. It's not unique to Appalachia in 1912. We see it in cults, in religious extremism, in political movements that wrap themselves in spiritual language. Someone charismatic claims special knowledge, introduces new practices, demands absolute trust, and ultimately causes harm. The people of Thorn Hollow weren't stupid or backward for falling for it. They were human. They lived in a time and place where religious authority was rarely questioned. They wanted to believe they were participating in something sacred, and Blackwood gave them exactly what they wanted, right up until it killed them. So when I think about that rain that smelled like blood, I think about it as a metaphor, as much as a potential reality. Blood represents life, death, sacrifice, and guilt. A rain that smells like blood is a rain of consequences, a deluge of karma for actions taken without full understanding. The people of Thorn Hollow opened themselves up to something they didn't understand. Whether that was a literal supernatural entity or simply the manipulations of a dangerous man doesn't actually matter to the outcome. They suffered. They died. Their community collapsed. And the smell, that persistent, undeniable smell that everyone reported, that was their shared trauma manifesting in the most visceral way possible. Smell is the sense most closely linked to memory and emotion. Of course, their collective trauma would express itself as a smell. Of course, it would be the smell of blood, but I can't completely dismiss the supernatural elements. I've tried. God knows I've tried. I've spent years looking for rational explanations, and I've found some. But not enough. Not enough to fully account for everything that happened. The water flowing upward in that cave, the exact timing of Blackwood's disappearance and the recovery of the sick, the geological changes, the discovery of his body a century later in a cave that shouldn't exist. These are facts, not folklore. They're documented, verifiable facts, and they don't add up to a neat, rational explanation. So here's my final assessment, for whatever it's worth. Something happened in Thorn Hollow in the spring of 1912. Whether it was entirely natural, entirely psychological, or something genuinely beyond our current understanding, it was real enough to destroy a community. The rain came. It smelled like blood. People got sick and died. A man vanished, and the survivors fled, carrying trauma that was so deep they couldn't even speak about it to their own children. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Natural phenomena, psychological manipulation, cultural trauma, and possibly something we don't yet have the framework to understand, all combining to create an event that defied simple explanation. And that's okay. Not everything needs a definitive answer. Sometimes the value is in the investigation itself, in the attempt to understand, in the respect we show to people's experiences, even when they challenge our worldview. The people of Thorn Hollow deserved better than what happened to them. They deserved a genuine minister, a trustworthy authority figure, a safe spiritual community. Instead, they got Josiah Blackwood, and it destroyed them. Remember that the next time someone asks you to participate in a ritual you don't understand, the next time a charismatic leader claims special knowledge or divine authority, the next time you're asked to take something on faith without question, the door Blackwood opened wasn't necessarily a supernatural portal. It might have been something much more mundane and much more dangerous. The door to blind obedience, to unquestioning faith, to the kind of trust that can be weaponized. That's a door that, once opened, is very hard to close. And the Appalachian Mountains remember what happens when it swings wide. I think about Margaret Ashby sometimes. She survived. She got out. She tried to warn people through her letters. But nobody listened. The official record dismissed her testimony. History forgot Thorn Hollow. Until now. So let this be a memorial, not just to the people who died, but to the danger of forgotten history. These stories matter. These warnings matter. The fact that we can't fully explain what happened doesn't mean we should ignore it. The rain that smelled like blood might have been algae, or atmospheric conditions, or mass hysteria, or something science hasn't discovered yet. It doesn't matter. What matters is that real people smelled it, real people suffered because of it, and real people tried to warn us about the circumstances that led to it. Listen to those warnings. Remember Thorn Hollow. Question authority. Demand explanations. Don't participate in rituals you don't understand. Don't trust strangers who know things they shouldn't. And if you ever find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains, in some hollow where the trees grow too thick and the air feels too heavy, and you smell something sweet and metallic on the wind, leave. Just leave. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed, and the mountains remember everything. That's the real horror of Thorn Hollow, not the supernatural possibilities, but the human realities. The exploitation, the manipulation, the trauma, the forgotten victims, the warnings nobody heeded. We like to think we're too sophisticated now, too educated, too modern to fall for something like this. But are we? Every year, people join cults. Every year, communities are torn apart by charismatic leaders who exploit faith for personal gain. Every year, warnings are ignored until it's too late. The specifics change. The technology changes. But human nature, that stays the same. Josiah Blackwood could exist today. He probably does exist in different forms, in different places. And people are still vulnerable to the same manipulation techniques he used. That's what keeps me up at night. Not the possibility of supernatural phenomena, but the certainty of human evil and human vulnerability. So yes, the rain that smelled like blood is a mystery. It might always be a mystery. But the real story of Thorn Hollow isn't about unexplained phenomena. It's about what happens when we stop questioning, when we trust blindly, when we allow ourselves to be led without understanding where we're going. The mountains remember. We should remember too. And maybe, just maybe, that's why Thorn Hollow disappeared so completely. Not because of supernatural intervention, but because the shame and trauma were so profound that everyone involved chose to forget. They chose to erase it from maps, from records, from family histories. But erasure doesn't equal resolution. The trauma persists, even when the story is forgotten. It seeps into the land, into the groundwater, into the very trees that grow over the ruins. That's what I felt when I stood where Thorn Hollow used to be. Not ghosts, but absence. The heavy weight of things deliberately forgotten, of warnings deliberately suppressed, of truths too uncomfortable to remember. We do ourselves no favors by forgetting. We honor no one by dismissing their experiences as primitive superstition. The people of Thorn Hollow were trying to tell us something important, and we have a responsibility to listen, even if we can't explain everything. Even if it makes us uncomfortable, especially if it makes us uncomfortable. Because that discomfort is important. It's the feeling that tells us we're approaching something true, something significant, something we need to understand, even if we can't fully explain it. The rain that smelled like blood is real enough in its effects. It destroyed lives, destroyed a community, left scars that persist across generations. Whether it was natural or supernatural almost doesn't matter compared to that reality. What matters is that we remember, we investigate, we try to understand. We learn from the warnings, and we stay vigilant because Josiah Blackwood is never just one person. He's a pattern, a type, a recurring danger in human society. He's the person who claims special knowledge and demands special trust. He's the person who introduces foreign elements into familiar traditions and calls it divine inspiration. He's the person who opens doors he doesn't fully understand and leaves others to deal with the consequences. Watch for him. Question him. Don't let him do to your community what he did to Thorn Hollow. That's the lesson. That's what the blood-scented rain was trying to tell us all along. The mountains remember, and now, so do you.